Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. So we're recording this at the beginning of July, and CrossFit is in the process of being sold to Eric Rosa, and Dave Castro also recently did a podcast with Sean Winlet and Tommy Marquez talking about some of the potential changes to the CrossFit Games season. And so give a quick background on our discussion today. It would have been fall of 2018. There were a lot of very sudden changes to the CrossFit Games and the entire qualifying process that did away with regionals, changed the way that the Open works so that people can qualify directly to the games from the Open, both as national champions of their country and top 20 in the world. But then national champions were pulled out of the top 20 so that more people were actually able to qualify. And then if you won a sanctional, you got to go to the games. But if you qualified through the Open, then your spot was backfilled. And it was just a mess. It was super, super confusing. And, at the time, pretty much everyone who was involved in the CrossFit Games season as a coach or an athlete or whatever had the sort of suspicion or inkling that perhaps Greg Glassman just started talking about some idea on a podcast and didn't really think it through. And then that became the way that the entire sport was structured. And after hearing Dave Castro talk about this, it seems like that was in fact the case, that this is just sort of like a pretty poorly thought through, impulsive decision about how the CrossFit Games season should work. And well, it actually seemed to go kind of okay in some ways. It was, as we just talked about, super messy and confusing, where people were, battling for 13th place in a competition where the top 12 had already qualified to potentially get a CrossFit Games spot. And then if someone did something later on in the season, then a bunch of other backfills would happen. And then that backfill would pull someone else out. And it's just like super, super confusing and not terribly exciting from like a spectator or an athlete perspective, because there wasn't an obvious way to actually get to the CrossFit Games. But simultaneously, the idea of having, multiple sanctional events and different times that people can compete throughout the season, and the ability for folks to kind of build their own season and actually develop a different training plan based upon what they want to do, rather than having to stick to the Open Regionals Games process, which was very high pressure because you really only had one chance at each of those stages to make it to the next one. So, there's positives and negatives to the old way of doing Open Regionals Games and the new way of having sanctionals plus some people qualifying from the Open, et cetera. And today we thought it would actually be interesting to talk through, what are the positives and negatives of the different qualification systems that we've seen, and then what would we actually like to see in the future, right? How do we think that the qualification process should work? Not necessarily should work, because, there's a lot of variables and stakeholders involved in this process, but just some ideas that we've thought of and things that we find interesting and might actually be helpful for folks, considering how the season should actually look. So John, I know you had something you wanted to start off with. What do you think, man? What do you think about all this?
Yeah, I think personally for me, as much as I didn't want regionals to stop, I kind of liked how the sanctional season played out. And we never really got to see it in its full capacity, in the sense that 2019 was kind of an abridged season with not that many sanctionals. And then 2020 obviously hasn't really taken place. So we never really got to see it, but I liked some of the pieces around it. I liked the way that there were different events spread through the year. I think the season was too long. I think the first qualifier for a sanctional event was, I think, a month after the games. What was the Dubai qualifier, or the Filthy 50 qualifier, all those kind of things? That was right after the games, right?
Yeah, and whatever the international qualifier was pretty quick after the games too, which was for, I don't remember exactly which events it was. Actually, that's another thing that I didn't even bring up, is this mess of qualifiers that make no sense, right? Even as like someone who coaches multiple people in the sport, and collectively we coach several people who are reasonably good and have a decent shot of qualifying for either sanctionals or potentially moving on to the games. And you're just like looking at these websites of these qualifiers, which make no sense and aren't updated properly. properly. And you're like, what the hell is even going on? I have
Yeah.
no idea. And your athletes are asking you like, hey, what should I do? Should I sign up for this? And you're like, dude, I don't know. I don't know
And
what to tell you.
it's one thing Castro talks about in the podcast he did on Talking Elite Fitness. It was, there are too many ways to get to the games. And one thing he hinted at, which I think may happen, is no more national champions. He mentioned something about how people are qualifying for the games who shouldn't be there, and like who are just because they were popular in social media, which I assume was something about Hunter McIntyre, which I agree with. He shouldn't have been there. It was ridiculous. But yeah, I think having that many different avenues to get to the games, whether it was through the Open or national champion or sanctionals, or like you say, finishing 12th at sanctionals and still getting an invite to the games, like that, I think there would need to be some kind of delineation between an event outside of the games season and qualifying for the games. And whether that is bringing back regionals in some capacity to have, okay, Open, regionals, games, and then all these sanctional events. Like Live and Loud has 6 events right now, I believe. You know, you see it in other individual sports like tennis, like golf, where you have these events through the season, and you kind of have season-ending events on that respect as well. Like having some kind of tour-based competition season whereby these athletes can earn a living, and then having Open, regionals, games as the almost like the Olympics of their sport.
Yeah, I think Live and Loud. I don't think they are go. I mean, I'm not too sure. I think even with all of the changes and announcements, they've gone ahead and they've put out their dates for next year. Right. And I think that, you know, what you might have from this is obviously other private companies that run competitions like Live and Loud, maybe trying to create something of their own. Whether that's going to have the success of something like Grid League, you don't know, but like you're probably going to see some factioning off. And I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of these competitions do have pool. There's prize money to be had, but I think that your point, John, about, you know, allowing athletes to be professional at the top of the sport, but I also think that needs to mature as well. You know, just based off of observations. There's a group of people who are competing at a lot of these events, and I'm not too sure if that is going to be a good long-term strategy for having a career in the sport. I think that there probably needs to be some level of governance in the sport so that you can see probably a good broad participation worldwide. Maybe not the national champion situation. I don't think that was. Yeah, there was definitely some people there at the games that, you know, they went for one workout, and I think that although it was a great experience and everything like that, there was definitely some people who were you know, just making all of those travel plans, doing all of that just to be sort of cut. But you know,
and that's something that Dave talked about briefly, in the sense of people that it's a test of the fittest. Like the games is supposed to be a test of the fittest. And people qualifying who aren't in that same realm doesn't really make sense for what the games are supposed to be.
Yeah, but I think that at the same time, you have to, I think for the sport to grow and for CrossFit to grow, and I think obviously if you want CrossFit to have a little bit more of a direction towards just having a bigger outreach, then I'm not 100% sure that going the sort of old route of regionals and basically having just the same people competing at the games year after year, it maybe there could be a way of making it bigger. There could be a way of creating competitions that lead up to the games where people can sort of maybe, you know, like a regional style thing where you get the national champions of each area, and then you have it, and it's, you know, based more on sort of continent areas of the world. And then you have basically the best of those people making it to the games, but then you have sanctionals also going on. So you have, because I know that, you know, in places, in for instance, in Europe, in Australia, and in the US, you have a lot of bubble athletes, people who are sort of borderline professional, really, really, really good, but they don't necessarily have a route to the games. other than sanctionals and other than maybe getting top spot at one of these competitions. But I think the sort of the whole mess of like, yes, the 12th place from this competition is going to make it. And then as well as that, just having these competitions acting completely independently and being CrossFit sanctioned events. I know obviously they were paying to be sanctioned events, but the programming itself, I think that there needs to be some clear direction as to how to, CrossFit is fairly chaotic, and I think that the variance and the constant development in the sport does keep it exciting, and I think that's a great thing to have. And you don't necessarily want people just training for the same thing all the time, but I do think that having some clear communication down that any event that is going to be CrossFit sanctioned, any event that is going to be getting you to the games in any way, it's going to have it's going to have the programming from the top or from people who are going to be endorsed from the top. But I think that there's obviously a number of layers to it. You want people to be able to thrive in the sport. You want people to be able to have a clear route of progress in the sport, and then you also want the sport to have a good reach for it to actually develop. For it to do what it's done over the last 10 years, which is, I think, how many years ago was it they sort of stopped putting the emphasis on putting out the media, and it was 2018, 2017, they made the shift to a lot more CrossFit health type stuff. But up until that point, you had a lot. The games did attract a lot of people, and it attracted, it filled gyms up to a certain degree.
Yeah, I think that what you're getting at there, just with the overall structure of the sport, like how does this actually work for all the stakeholders involved, is something that's really important. That CrossFit HQ has sort of historically been, I don't know, kind of like just rude and, dismissive of, where people are like, hey, this kind of doesn't make any sense. There's people who sort of are basing their living on, competing in this sport, and there's sponsors that need to make money, and there's coaches who make money. And, there's this question mark of like, how much do the CrossFit Games benefit or hinder gyms who are affiliated with CrossFit? Like, these are all things that are out there sort of in the world and in the community. And the response from HQ has always historically been sort of like, so what? We don't care. Figure it out. Like same thing where it's like, hey, Dave, we think that like maybe this lane kind of is messed up compared to the other ones. And then there were cuts based upon this event. Like, do you think that maybe you could think about how to do that better in the future? And it's like, no, you need to adapt to whatever's happening. And the fittest people are always going to adapt. And, that's if you're a Navy SEAL and it's like, you're going on this mission and everything is going to go completely wrong and you have to figure it out. Like, yeah, sure. That's a reasonable way to treat feedback or to treat things going wrong. But if you're running a sport, which is intended to be at least some sort of like fair competition, and it has a lot of people who need to want to participate in it for it to work, I just don't think that that's a helpful attitude to have. It's like, and I get it. Like, I understand that part of what Castro is doing is playing a specific character as the sort of like evil mastermind of the CrossFit Games, and that may not be the same character, that the traits of that character may not be the way that he actually is in real life, or the way that some of these decisions are made. But it is really frustrating, and like I said, just not helpful for people who actually have a stake in how the sport develops. So that's just like a general concern that I have. But something that I would like to kind of dig into, and John, I think maybe you mentioned this, and this I thought was the most interesting and salient point from Dave's podcast with Tommy and Sean, was that, there were just too many ways for people to qualify for the games, and it didn't make any sense. And so I think there's sort of two questions that I have about this, right? One is, okay, what should the qualifying process for the CrossFit Games look like? And are there things that could be taken from the regionals structure, or things that could be taken from the sanctional structure in a way to kind of like wed those things that make sense? Then the other thing is, okay, what does the overall landscape of the sport look like, right? I mean, is this something where the CrossFit Games are the be all end all every year, and that's the only thing that people are doing? Or, does Loud and Live create some sort of other competing fitness cup that maybe doesn't have exactly the same prestige as the CrossFit Games, but it does have something attached to it, right? I mean, you could even think of this like what does the soccer landscape look like? You have the English Premier League, you have La Liga, you have all these other, very prominent, prestigious leagues in specific countries, right? And then all of those teams sort of then actually compete with each other to sort of like crown the best team in Europe. Then you also have the World Cup where national teams compete. And then you have the Olympics where national teams compete. And all of these things are valid and prestigious ways of actually competing. And, there's prizes associated with some of them, and people are paying a lot of money into this ecosystem. And, at some level, those things do probably compete with each other a little bit, but it's just sort of like, okay, this is the landscape of the sport and this is how it works. So, is that something that we could potentially see with quote unquote functional fitness, where you have the CrossFit Games season, you have whatever this Loud and Live season is, if the IF3 succeeds in getting functional fitness into the Olympics, then you have this sort of like Olympic champion of functional fitness, which is going to be adjacent. Someone mentioned Grid League previously, that some people may try some other formats of similar types of movements to actually, create a different sport that shares characteristics. A bunch of CrossFitters are on the Titan Games right now, which is more of like a TV show than a sport per se. But it's like, okay, what does this actually look like over time? Do we have these multiple different avenues for people to compete in? And then do those kind of reach some sort of equilibrium where, athletes are able to balance them? Like you said, Luke, and actually have some sort of career that makes sense in terms of finances, and then also just not having to like kill themselves like every single month of the year with like, okay, now I have to do this stupid online qualifier, which is 5 workouts over 5 days. Now I have to do this stupid online qualifier, which is 1 workout for 4 weeks. Then I actually have to go and do this event. And then I qualified for regionals, so I have to go do regionals. And it's like, that just turns into like a shit show, honestly, for athletes. So, I mean, that's a lot of different ideas. And I don't know if I necessarily have a recommendation or a perspective on which is the way things should go. But I guess I'm curious on, let's start with, what are your thoughts on how people should be getting to the CrossFit Games? What should that look like?
You just take a breath, Todd, as well. Just yeah, I mean, I think kind of into what Luke was saying there, I think there's an opportunity for potentially a separation in events, like what you were saying about the live and loud season. Why not have the live and loud season be like a pro tour where you can't get to the games from it, but you can, they have their, whatever it is, 5 events, I think they have 6 events. But why not have them all as standalone events, and then maybe something kind of rogue invitational-esque where the top 3 from each of those events competes. And it's, it's not about the games, and you're going to see the same kind of athletes in them, but it's about the money and being essentially a professional athlete from that standpoint. I know Dave mentioned, I lost my train of thought.
CrossFit.
Oh yeah, CrossFit, of course.
Thrusters. I think that the open can't be a way of going to the games. I think that's. I
agree with that.
Like that there's just too many opportunities for people to spin it. Even though they are, I'm not too sure if they did check every video. No, they didn't. They didn't even check every video. So I think that they checked 2 videos from national champions. It was like, okay, do you make it past video 1? Then do you make it past video 2? And that's just not like the one thing that regionals did have, and I can't really talk to like the individual judges. I think there needs to be some professionalization of judging. But like they had people who were head judges at the games going to each regional, traveling there and running like a pretty tight ship. And you had obviously, I think it was pretty much all HQ staff. They were judging at the games. So you have people who like they know what's going on. It's not just some random person at the box who basically just copied the answers from the person who gave all the answers out at the gym when they did the judges course, right? So you can't qualify to the games from the open. I don't think that's correct. If you do, I think to make the sport have a wider reach, I think maybe some element of regionals could exist, and you have something where national champions from each region or each country, they can come together. But then there needs to be something for all of the people who, all the people in the US who, are like very, very good athletes who don't necessarily have an opportunity to compete as a national champion. So I think, I think that there needs to be, there could be an element of both. I do think the sanctionals is a cool thing. I think it's a good thing. But one thing I did actually like that Dave was saying in the podcast was sort of like having this, having sort of these levels essentially that people can work towards in the open. So for instance, if you are, if you are finishing in this spot, then that classifies you as this type of athlete, and then from then on, when you are trying to qualify for other competitions, you sort of have a bit of a profile about you, which I think is a pretty good thing. And I think that that's easily, like, they can create that fairly easily. And I also do think that there needs to be a commitment for athletes. If you want to compete in CrossFit, there needs to be you need to do the open, or you need to do something to sort of create these baselines. There needs to be some sort of entry point that everyone goes through, because you had people who did. I think you have people last year at the games who didn't do the open, or maybe I think this year you had. So I think that there needs to be, everyone does that, because I think that does do something for the sort of worldwide global community. I think that obviously having the ability to sort of compare your results with the best in the sport, obviously a lot of people are going to be pretty demotivated by that, but at the same time a lot of people are motivated by that, and they're actually thinking, oh, holy crap, like these are the things that people are actually capable of, and that's something that people feel like they can work towards, even if it's just 10% of what someone else is getting. But there's something there that sort of gives everyone a shared experience, and I think that is one of the things that is when people do talk about the CrossFit community, it's this sort of shared experience that people know sort of what certain workouts feel like, certain combinations of movement feels like, and it sort of does create a bit of an identity. And I think that that's something that you can foster in actually a positive way, and the open could be a way of doing that.
I think that kind of plays into, again, another thing that Castro was talking about in terms of the participation of people. He talks about how the open was all about participation and inclusion of everyone in the community. And I think he referenced like Wadapalooza, or a outside event where they were talking about, how many people actually get to go and compete that aren't elite athletes. And again, I think there's an argument there for the delineation between the competitive season and these outside events. Wadapalooza had 5,000 people competing or something stupid, like across all the teams and all the different divisions. Like, have events for that. The open can be like that, and then have more condensed, I don't want to say elite competitions, but more like performance based, where it's like, you have to qualify, and that gets you to the games, like regionals. And then have those, Wadapalooza, Granite Games, all the kind of previous sanctional events. Well, that is where anyone can go and compete. And like you were talking about, Luke, having that designation coming out of the open of, I'm an intermediate athlete, I'm an RX athlete, whatever the framework is, and I'm going to Wadapalooza to compete as a intermediate team athlete, and having those opportunities to compete without having to dilute the games down to all these different opportunities together.
Yeah, I think that to me, the obvious solution is to create something that resembles, the system that something like USA weightlifting has, where that's obviously simpler because you just have a total. And if you got a certain total at a certain type of event, then you can move into the next type of event, right? It's like, great, you totaled 200 kilos at this local meet in some high school gym. Great. That means you get to lift in the B session at whatever the next larger event is, and I think that you can make something like that for CrossFit, where it's like, great, if you do the open and you get, this ranking, or you finish in whatever we classify this tier as, that means like you said, the Castro brought up, you can compete in an intermediate division at this type of thing. If you win an intermediate division, that means that then you can compete in whatever the advanced division is at this type of thing, right? And like, I don't know how you handle the qualification process, whereas you have more slots or more people who want slots and you have slots available. Is it just a first come first serve sign up type of thing? Because it's not going to be like a weightlifting meet where it's like, oh, surprise, we accidentally had 68 more people hit this qualifying total than we thought, and we already run 2 hours behind on these events because we just don't know what we're doing. So I guess this is just going to last 15 hours longer than we thought. Like, that's just not going to be an option for the way that these types of events are run. But what I see happening is that you set up events that you can qualify to the CrossFit Games from, right? You take whatever the top 5 or whatever is decided, sort of like they were doing with super regionals, from those specific events. And that's the only way you can get to the games. You have to get to the games through some sort of in-person qualifying event. Like you said, Luke, the open there's way too much going on there. There's too many opportunities for people to outright actively cheat. There's too many opportunities for people to kind of like fudge a little bit and not purposely cheat. And honestly, just the ability to do one workout 3 times over a weekend, 5 weeks in a row, only doing like barbell stuff and pull-ups and double unders is not the same thing at all as, being able to compete at the CrossFit Games. So that's like a standard frustration a lot of people have. And I think that the way that I'd like to see it happen is like, great, there's all these ways that you can feed into this system. The open feeds into it, local events feed into it, whatever. All those things then potentially feed into a next layer that might be like, what was it before? Sectionals, right? Something like sectionals, where it's like, okay, here's a layer. And then that feeds into these larger events that maybe they're sanctioned events, maybe they're regional style events that are run by CrossFit HQ. But those are the only way that you can actually get to the games. And there's a lot of ways that you can feed into those events. So I think something like that makes sense to me. And it tries to sort of take the best parts of each of these systems, and then hopefully eliminate some of the negative parts of each of them.
I think that this is sort of just bring it back to maybe like the sort of more grassroots level of the sport. But I think that there needs to also be some influence from the top in local competitions, whether that's the ability for competitions to sort of align themselves with CrossFit in some way. I mean, I know that here in Spain, there's a lot of local competitions, but there's a lot of different weird, wonderful ways of qualifying for them. And it's really messy. And, like to give you a bit of an example, I think in one, I mean, you can test for the unknown and unknowable, and this can be including of everything. But I think in one workout that had some of my athletes having to do, it will require them to go through like a pretty shoulder heavy workout with a pair of dumbbells. And then they had to go into a 10 rep max overhead squat. And I'm like, and then there's, if you look at programming, say for instance, from the CrossFit Games, there's a reason why you have like when you start to push those maxes beyond a 1 rep max, for every single rep, it increases the potential for injury quite a bit. And, I think that just having, a bunch of people who think they know CrossFit, done it for a couple of years, and all of a sudden be like, okay, we're going to put on competition because we've got a bit of money and we're just going to do these crazy things with programming because these are some cool ideas that I've got. And I think that you just have to have something that's a little bit more real, a little bit more robust, a little bit more just simple as well for people who are trying to enter into the sport. Like I think one, I think one of the things I noticed is that usually the difference between, say, elite, RX, and scaled categories is literally the only difference is the weights of movements. But you still have people who, in the scale category can't really do squat snatches efficiently, but having to do multiple reps. Like there needs to be just a little bit more clear guidelines and structure and around these things, because otherwise you just see a lot of shit, and it's sometimes as a coach it's frustrating to try and navigate that, because I'm having to sort of like knowingly put my athletes and prepare them for something that is just not could be potentially dangerous, because it's their only opportunity to sort of compete in that area. So I think that like if you want to develop the sport, and I think of this in terms of like my experience growing up playing rugby, it was pretty clear, like as a kid, you played touch rugby, right? No contact. Then you move on and you start training once a week. Then you move on, you start training twice. Like there's this clear development as you go through. And then when you are, for instance, one of the things I noticed about sports in the UK is that, from the Premiership Rugby League and then from the Premier Football League, there's a clear line all the way down to complete amateur football and complete amateur rugby. And I don't necessarily think that exists in the US because I think that there's just a lot more commercial influence in sport in general. But I think that something like that is pretty cool because, for instance, that this little Sunday league team that plays down and they kick the shit out of each other like every weekend, like they are maybe 15 leagues behind the Premiership, right? And if they do really well for 15 seasons, they could make it, to the Premiership. But it's just having something like that would, I think, be a lot better for people. It would just allow people just not to get crazy injured and completely burnt out by the sport because it's just random and chaotic and there's no clear structure. But these are obviously things that are going to develop with time and as the sport matures. But I hope that is something that happens because the grassroots experience has to be really, really good. And I think that the grassroots experience for a lot of people who have been involved in the sport for a long time, like us, right, is this was a cool thing that people did and everyone didn't really know what they were doing and they were like helping each other out in the warm-up room, and it was a positive experience in that sense. Whereas now you have a lot of competitions that they basically just try to make mini versions of the games, and it's like, does it really need to be like that, or could it be a little bit more community driven? Maybe just 2 workouts, maybe something that's just a little bit easier to get yourself into, rather than actually just like killing yourself for 6 workouts over a weekend and then all of a sudden being like, well, I only want to do that twice a year, and then that's it. 3 months you take off for training. These are things that I've seen.
Yeah, I think the community aspect is important. Referencing back to Grid League, I think one of the reasons it struggled to really get traction was that there was no grassroots in any capacity with it. There's this pro league and that's it. And since then, there's been some development of some kind of more local versions of it. But I think there has to be some kind of support structure for people to have an interest in it. No one really, I don't think people are as engaged with a sport if they've never done it before or if they've never really grown up with it. That's why you see soccer in America. Like people don't really care about the pro league because they don't grow up playing it. They grow up playing.
I think this generation is different because I think that, our generation did actually grow up playing soccer in America and that people do care now.
They don't care.
Argue with you, John.
They do not care. I can tell you that much. Do you know when the MLS season is starting back up after COVID?
I actually don't, but I did see.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You don't know because it's not a big deal.
This is actually pretty funny.
Who won the Premiership this year?
Yeah, I play soccer 3+ times per week and don't follow it at all. But all of the people who I play with follow it obsessively, and they try to talk to me about it, and I'm like, I just play. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, it's just different. You grow up playing a sport, you have a lot more engagement in it, whether you play or not later in life. And I think for people to have an interest in the elite of CrossFit, it's people who are doing CrossFit. It's people who are in the gym 3-4 days a week, regardless of their level, that watch the games and do it. And I think to foster that kind of competitive environment at the top end, you still need those lower level competitions. Like you're saying, there has to be that engagement for the intermediate athlete to compete in a smart way and to compete at something that is appropriate for them. Like, is it Festivus Games that does that? Whereas you have to be like a certain, I can say that, a certain level of terribleness to compete. Like, you can't be a good athlete and go to their competitions because it's designed for people to give them their first taste of competition.
I'll add something on that as someone who has organized a local fitness competition for several years. I think there's a really big challenge there. And John, you started to touch on it, which is that competitions that are only for beginners do reasonably well, right? Where it's like, hey, this is not intimidating. There's going to be nothing crazy here. You won't have to touch a pull-up bar. These are the workouts. They're super easy, not necessarily easy, but they're not anything crazy. And then, or the event has to be something that's like you said, Luke, like a mini CrossFit Games. Like, this is going to be fucking nuts. We have these crazy workouts we thought of that don't make any sense. And we saw these few things on Instagram. We just slammed them together and you guys are going to get after it. And unfortunately, the market kind of doesn't bear something in between, even on the local level, right? That people either want to do something, but are super afraid to. And so they feel comfortable signing up for like a beginner level competition, or they want to do something like super serious and be like, hey, you're an intermediate athlete and you can like kind of do some toes to bar. Maybe you don't want to do chest to bar in a workout. Your squat snatch is super, super ugly. So like maybe you should actually just like do dumbbell snatches instead. Like, people don't want to hear that. And we talk about that, with people in the gym all the time too, where it's like, hey man, maybe you shouldn't actually do this super heavy power clean workout and kipping handstand push-ups as prescribed, because like you can't do either of them really. And, Jimmy in class is like, looks at the coach and just does it anyway. And I think that dynamic plays out in competitions as well, where, maybe what you should be doing for a competition is something that's like, hey, we're going to do some sets of strict pull-ups and we're going to do maybe like a Metcon with some rowing and dumbbell snatches, and we'll go for a run. And it's like, yeah, that's a great idea for an intermediate athlete, but intermediate athlete is going to look at that and be like, this is a stupid event. I'm signing up for this one where we do squat snatches and muscle ups and handstand walking, because that's what they want to do.
Yeah, and then I think that one of the issues with that is the fact that a lot of these competitions, they're competitions because they want to make money, and it's like, and I would say that like the competitions that probably make good money are the ones that are simple, fun, team competitions. So there's more people involved, and they just give people like a solid experience, but they don't necessarily build it up too much. But what you do see in areas where CrossFit is still developing is people try to sort of push because they want to be the leader in the market as such. And then all of a sudden they're like, yeah, they're trying to create a mini CrossFit Games and it's just a mess. The timetable is like over by 3 hours. You've got things like a max strict press in there, which is, fantastic to judge. And and then what you end up having is you end up having a load of people coming away from those competitions being like, yeah, I need the hardest training possible, right? Or they come, which is completely out of what they should be doing, or they come away from those competitions and being like, this is shit, I don't want to do this. I'm going to do triathlons instead because that's just a lot easier and simpler, and it's not as much hassle. But I think you just have to have something that maybe allows people to compete maybe once every 2 months or whatever, but there needs to be some clear guidance and delineation from the top. It just can't be a bunch of people just doing what they want to do and calling it XFit. Because
Luke, I really like that idea where I think that, guidance from the top is tricky because it's like, okay, well, what is CrossFit going to do? Is CrossFit going to review all of your events and say, cool, we're down with this? Like the sort of relationship between the top down and bottoms up version of creating events is challenging and messy. But I do think that some sort of seal of approval potentially gives an event, enough prestige within whatever the local economy is that people will actually sign up for it. And, how do you actually get that event? Maybe you do submit your events. Maybe you show that you've actually run your competition on time repeatedly for a few years or something like that. And then it's like, okay, cool. This event, sanctioned is maybe not the right word for it, but there is some sort of like, okay, this is an approved event, which then probably does generate more interest just based upon it being approved. And then if it is approved, then that gives you some leeway to be like, yeah, guess what? You're not going to do something really stupid, and it's going to be reasonably programmed and it's going to run on time. And like, that's what you're going to get out of it, right? And that potentially helps the local economy actually, focus in on that event rather than just doing whatever people see, or whatever event like has whatever prestige just associated with it from randomness or the right person showing up to it one year.
Yeah, like I think that education is probably going to be a good way of that happening, and it could be as simple as having an online course of, hey, this is a good way to run competitions. You have, And I've been working on. I was lucky enough to work and just sort of run the programming for like a big competition in the Middle East for a couple of years, Battle of the East, and they hired a pair of sort of consultant guys who basically came along, and they had their own sort of organization and staging setup that they created that was similar to regionals. And it just created like a really robust and efficient way of getting people through. And okay, we have people calling you out for your heats, because a lot of the time it's just like, here's the heat list, there's the warm up area is like completely, whatever. But I think that just having some guidelines around that, and that could be as simple as another online course from CrossFit Training. But yeah, just that will, it's just, you can operate as same as the sort of like the affiliate way, but not necessarily having to have people pay as much money to be associated with CrossFit.
Yeah, and I think that the sort of like free market, just let the market sort it out is probably not the right way for that to work.
Yeah,
John, what do you think? What you want to sum this up for us?
I want to sum it up. If you're in the Midwest area and you're looking to compete, looking for a competition to go to, one of the best run and most well-established competitions in the area is South Loop Games, brought to you by South Loop Strength and Conditioning.
Here's the thing: we didn't even talk about the fact that like no one's doing any events because of COVID anytime soon either. Yeah. So that's a whole other wrench in the gears of the apparatus.
Like the Open being pushed back to February, which is what it sounds like it's going to be. Realistically, between now and then, there's probably not going to be competition. The Games isn't going to happen as much as they keep pushing it. With what's going on in California right now, the Games isn't going to happen. I know Dave said he doesn't want to have a cutoff date of when they finally call it, because he wants to kind of keep the hope alive, but it's not going to happen. The qualifier for live and loud competitions is going to be in January. We don't know how that builds into the game structure for next year, but the Open in February is probably the next competition that even local competitions probably aren't happening until 2021 in some capacity. So,
yeah, I mean, the idea of getting, 50 to 100 people inside together, all breathing heavy from different parts of the area and neighboring states or regions or whatever. It's like, yeah, I don't think that's gonna be happening anytime soon.
Maybe if they develop a test that takes like 30 seconds or a minute to get results of, to be able to say, hey, you can have a gathering of 100 people, but everyone has to go through testing before they can go in the room or whatever. Then, if that comes into play, then maybe these events start to pick up again. But South Loop Games 2021. If you're looking for a well-programmed, well-structured, well-run competition that is going to challenge the top athletes and allow you to get a taste of competition if you're an intermediate athlete, then check it out. SouthLoopGames.com.
Hopefully that URL still works. I think it does. Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.